speakers in a minute, but just to also say each speaker will speak for 20 minutes, and then there'll be a chance for 10 minutes of discussion, and then at the end we will have a plenary. So please, I'll try to keep an eye on the chat and the questions you're formulating at whatever stage, but that's to give you a sense of the pattern of how we'll run the round table. So the four speakers, Nicolas Brando from Queen's University in Belfast is hi Nico, is a philosopher and a writer on ethics, and he co-edited the book on philosophy and child poverty, which very much inspired Lorella, Judith and I to start thinking about these issues. He's also written very incisively on how to conceptualize the social and political situatedness of the poverty of children and their families, and looked at the relational dimensions of poverty as a form of capability deprivation. So he's going to set the scene for us in relation to some of his work and some of the contemporary issues. Professor Lebola Moletsani from the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa is, the scope of her professorship is very concerned with rural poverty. Her work in the university is concerned with social inclusion and social connectedness, and she's worked for 30 years on the ravages of apartheid and its long aftermath in South Africa, and particularly on, as this is lived out in the lives of poor girls in rural areas. So her attentive, detailed fieldwork allows us to attend very closely to questions of voice and gender and poverty. Our third speaker is Professor Gemma Moss from UCL. Gemma made her name in writing about literacy, but over the last year, in response to COVID in the UK, she's led a team of social researchers who've drawn on their experience of sociology and social research to document what teachers have done and how schools have attended to poverty and education challenges in the UK. And I think this issue of poverty in the UK was barely being talked about at the beginning of the epidemic, and now it's constantly in the press, but we see the kind of erraticness of the government's response. And I think Gemma's going to distill some of this contemporary, the policy and practice theme for us through that presentation. And lastly, James Wilson, also from UCL, Professor James Wilson is going to give us a set of reflections on themes of conceptualization and measurement and the effects of poverty on education fairness. And we really appreciate his, the ways in which he's going to look with us at this pressing contemporary issue, draw on his experience of thinking about health, public health in relation to thinking about public education and some of the justice issues it raises. So we've got a very rich range of speakers. My thanks to them all. And I'll turn now to Nico to start us off.
Thanks so much, Elaine. There's works being done in the building next door. So if you could let me know if you can't hear me, and I'll try to hide from the noise at some point. Also, can you see my slides? Perfect.
Perfect, thank you.
Thanks so much, Elaine. And thanks, Lorella, Judith, and Elaine for inviting me. I'm very happy to be a part of this roundtable. During my time today, I wish to look at the problematic tension and interdependence between child work and education for disadvantaged. I was very happy to be asked to explore the link between poverty and education, and I thought that it would be a good opportunity. I'm currently working on issues of working rights and civil and political rights of children. I thought that it would be interesting to put these three elements into perspective: education, child work, and child poverty. Basically, my intention is to see how our moral assessments and our proposals to tackle child labor and non-enrollment in schools can be strongly conditioned by deprivation and lack of institutional supports for poor children. I will start by outlining what I understand by child poverty. I will then look at how education and child work are understood in the law and how the relationship creates difficult moral dilemmas. We'll then present the standard position in both the legal and theoretical literature on education and work to address this, that intends to address this moral issue, namely the incompatibility view of education and work. And I will then raise two important problems that I see with this approach and will suggest an alternative that intends to address this tension between child work and education. Child poverty, as Judith mentioned before, can be considered an issue of high moral urgency. Children did not choose to live in poverty. They are usually born into it through intergenerational transmission. And without support by political, economic, and social institutions and norms, children will grow in poverty, probably stay in poverty, and inevitably transmit their deprived condition to the next generation. From a multidimensional understanding of what poverty is, the deprivation suffered by poor children goes beyond mere lack of economic resources, although obviously these are important. Poverty is morally problematic because it entails irreparable harms to children's short and long-term well-being and agency. Poverty is a condition, as Joe Wolf and Avner Deshalit call it, of clustered disadvantages. It entails harm to child's mental, physical, and emotional well-being. It entails an absence of resources and goods that ensure a dignified life. It entails lack of educational access and opportunities. And very importantly, it entails a lack of control over one's options and choices. As with the link between education and poverty, lack of access to schooling in itself is already a core element of any multidimensional poverty analysis. Education, as Judith mentioned before, is a key factor in breaking the poverty cycle. Children accessing schools can develop the intellectual and social skills required to improve their condition, to see life from a different angle, and to expand their employment opportunities. Schools are also protective environments in which children's well-being is monitored, sometimes nourishment is provided, and psychological and emotional support is granted. On the other hand, core determinant for the deprived children's absence from school and their limited opportunities to get an education is the fact that many have to work, remunerated or not, in order to help with their own and their family's subsistence. Work is an inevitable part of the lives of many deprived children. They either work for money in the streets and shops to gain some much needed income for their families, or many of them carry out non-remunerated work in their family business, in the farm, doing household chores, or caring for other family members. For many children, working implies not going to school at all. For many others, it implies very long days between working and studying, or being enrolled in school but barely going, or barely studying as they are too tired to do so. Some children find a balance between their work and their school duties, but this is not always an easy task, as most schooling systems are not sufficiently accommodating the particular needs of many working children. In short, it is generally considered that child work and labor especially, due to its conflicts with children's schooling, but also due to the physical, emotional, and mental harms that it may create on children, is a problematic obstacle to breaking the poverty cycle, and thus should be abolished. The hypothesis goes, children should not be allowed to work because of the harm it causes them, because of the impact it has on their educational opportunities and their overall life prospect. That is, work is bad for children, it keeps them trapped in the poverty cycle. However, an important issue comes to the fore when dealing with child work, particularly in the situation of deprived children. For many children, attempting to escape poverty and alleviate the needs of their families requires actually for them to work. That is, the fact that they work may be, for many children, the only way to stay away from their most dire deprivations. This is why I want to look at child work deeper, in order to understand the particular ways in which it relates to children's schooling, up to what point they are in fact in tension, and up to what point may we have to concede to its existence, its potential benefits to the deprived child population, and how we may find a better balance between our moral commitments to education and the reality of child work. Okay, let's start by clarifying what is meant by these two concepts of education and work, how they are most regularly used both in law and in policymaking. I've already defined poverty in a multidimensional understanding. Now I want to look at how education and work fit into this picture. So as I will explain later on, a core problem with the normative analysis of child work and education derives directly from how these concepts are used and defined in legal and policy making. In case of education, education in law and policy making tends to be restricted to its formal and institutionalized form. That is, as formal schooling. When education is mentioned in relation to poverty alleviation or to child work discourses, it appeals to children's access to the schooling system and to the years of formal education an individual has received. This definition is problematic as it already prefigures the scope of normative options available to address the question of deprived children's access to an education. Non-traditional and informal educational settings are thus excluded from what is considered when asking whether children have access to education. You can already imagine how this can affect and limit the way policy solutions are framed. Education in law is both a human right and a right particularly assigned to children by the Convention on the Rights of the Child, beyond national legislation. In the Convention on the Rights of the Child, Article 28 defines the duties of the state and guardians on how to secure children's access to schooling, for example, through compulsory and free primary education. And Article 29 details what this education should encompass in terms of rationale, content, and curriculum. As to work, when dealing with issues of child work in law and policy, the focus tends to lie on what is termed as child labor. That is, child labor is the forms of remunerated or non-remunerated employment of children, which can be detrimental to their mental, physical, or emotional well-being, which deprives them of their childhood, or those which conflict with their education, understood as formal schooling. Child work and child labor are strongly legally regulated, both at the international and the national levels. Minimum age for employment of any kind are enforced, for example, with the ILO Convention of 1976 on minimum ages. In particular, legislation is applied to protect children from labor that is hazardous and to eliminate what are termed the worst forms of child labor, such as slavery, prostitution, etc., in the ILO Convention of 1999. Although the Convention on the Rights of the Child is a bit less specific on the morality of child labor or immorality of child labor, Article 32 does, while not establishing minimum ages for work, it claims that children should be protected from any work that exploits them, that harms them, or that interferes with their education. Thus, I think that the general guideline here is that children below the minimum ages of employment, that is by the end of schooling, do not have the right to work in any remunerated form, and only adults can be employed in what are termed hazardous jobs. I think it's valuable to see and think about these definitions and legislation in tandem, as how one enforces one greatly affects the way the other one is implemented. In short, following the definitions and patterns in international law, children both have, on the one hand, a right to an education, with the primary education being compulsory and free. On the other hand, children should be protected from carrying out any work which conflicts with this right, and moreover, should be protected from any kind of employment which may harm them in any way. If one adds to this dyad of legislation, the ILO conventions, not only should children be protected from harmful labor, but they should be restricted as well from performing any employment until after their school years have ended. This tandem of legislation on education and on that regulates children's education and children's work, and the consequent normative understanding of the relationship between work and education can be defined as the incompatibility view. It basically claims that work inevitably interferes with the realization of children's rights to an education, in the sense that it affects their opportunity to attend school, it forces them to drop out, and it forces them to juggle their time between both. Education and work are thus seen as mutually exclusive activities. Children are either in school or at work, but they cannot have the right to an education fulfilled if they work. This view of work and education, on the one hand, attempts to achieve children's rights to an education by banning activities which are considered incompatible with, and by enforcing the compulsory nature of education in order to force parents to send their children to school instead of work. This is what is called a compulsion and ban policy. There is, of course, an element of truth in this normative intuition. Child work does interfere with children's rights to an education by imposing obstacles to their access and progression in formal schooling. This would mean that by banning children from working and by making going to school compulsory, we can overcome the dual moral commitment posed by this dyad of issues. It attempts to protect children from the harms that threaten them by working, and it attempts to ensure the benefits that schooling will have on their short and long-term well-being and agency. So I want to show the limitations of this incompatibility view, and I basically see two main issues with it. Mainly, its lack of accounting for diversity and intersectionality, and its wrongful construal for the causes and sources of non-enrollment in schools. To the first, so there is little proof that the normative proposal deriving from the incompatibility view and the compulsion and ban policies actually achieve their dual objective of increasing school enrollment and reducing child labor. This is because, as it can be inferred, the relationship between school and work is much more complex. First, the intersectionalities and plural conditioning factors, which determine the relationship between these two variables of work and schooling, are radically different in different social settings, for different ages, genders, and for different kinds of work. An intersectional analysis of the tension between school and work basically shows that appealing to incompatibility for all cases and all instances is necessarily exaggerated. There are many factors tied to the individual's child's condition, to the working conditions, and to the schooling conditions, which may affect the balance of this equation. This means, put simply, that a one-size-fits-all solution is in practice inadequate for tackling the needs of and the diverse realities of children's lives. Moreover, beyond this intersectional variation on the relationship between work and education for deprived children, there is one core issue that affects the cleanliness of the incompatibility normative proposal, namely the issue of the source and causality in the relationship between work and school. There seems to be an assumption that children do not go to school because they work, as if work were the source of the problem. As I intend to explore further, this is definitely not the case, or at least it is not the end of the line. Following Joe Boyden, I believe we must ask a simple but very elucidating question. Policymakers, I quote, concerned to attract more children into education and away from labor, need first to ask themselves why children work instead of attending school. Sorry, I did pause. Do you hear the work on the next building? No? Okay, that's good. So, why children work instead of attending school? I believe that there are two answers to this question that lead us away from the normative proposals of the incompatibility view. First reason why, at least in the most problematic cases, children work instead of going to school is because they are poor. They have to work. It is not a choice, but a need. Second reason why children work instead of going to school is not only that they have to work due to need, but that there are no institutional arrangements and supports in place to account for their reality. The traditional institution of the school may clash with their condition as workers, not necessarily because they are workers, but because the institution of the school is not made for or adapted to individuals like them. Accounting for the source of work and non-enrollment in schools implies looking at child work in a different light. It implies seeing it as an externality produced by poverty, in most but not all cases, obviously. Work and non-enrollment in schools are both consequences, in most cases, of deprivation and need. If we actually want to address the problem, taking the inevitable constraints imposed by non-ideal reflection requires accounting for the fact that as long as deprivation and need are still lingering, child work and school absenteeism will not change substantially, regardless of how much normative force we put on policing them instead of their actual root. I want to look then at these two issues separately. First, the issue of need, and second, the issue of an education that adapts to the needs of working children. So how does economic deprivation and need lead to child work and non-enrollment? I think that an important reason why economic deprivation and need lead to child work and non-enrollment is that the relative value of a child's formal education is strongly conditioned by, first, the perceived value of the child's time for income-generating activities, and second, by the relative value of the household income for other needs. A deprived household's income is highly limited, and the cost of schooling, even if not large, may not be a priority when other household perceived needs take priority. Also, a child's time may be perceived as more valuable if she gains her own income, supports the work of the family, or takes care of the household or other siblings, or etc., so that other members of the household can have more time to gain an income. Even households that value the importance of a child's education may not be able to afford sending them to school, as relatively there are more urgent issues to attend. It doesn't matter how stringent compulsion and ban policies are. When in need, there is simply no incentive for a child to go to school if her time and income can be put to better use. Families dodge potential infringements. Families dodge potential infringements of both legislations by registering children in schools, but rarely allowing them to go, thus dodging compulsion, and make use of their time by either working at the margins of the legal market or carrying out work at home, the farm, or caring for other family members. If a family is in need and can barely achieve subsistence, there are no incentives in having another mouth to feed that doesn't generate an economic benefit. Compulsion and ban policies are, in this sense, insufficient for addressing the actual root of the problem that affect many children's condition. Being aware and conscious of the reality in which these children live implies exploring normative answers that account for their situated selves. This, I believe, requires going into two different directions. First, one should focus on redistribution of resources, on providing safety nets, conditional cash transfers, increased minimum wages, and in the state and businesses taking a more engaged and responsibility-based role in the welfare of children. There is tackling the issue of poverty directly. Moreover, as has been noted before, for many children, access to school is actually a significant cost for their working. They work in order to pay for their education, etc. Others, for example, start working because they are disappointed by the schooling system. So, for example, waiving fees, providing resources, and improving quality of schooling can be a valuable incentive for children to go to school. If poverty is the reason why children work and don't go to school, then poverty is what must be addressed. Any alternative will not get us where we want to arrive. I'm almost done. So with regards to an inclusive education, I believe that situating the normative reflection in the reality of working children's lives, as mentioned above, requires realistic solution to non-ideal circumstances. That is, if solving the poverty problem is too big a bundle to achieve, which I think is possibly the case in most countries, then we must think of ways to harmonize the inevitable reality of children working and the normative objective of protecting them from harm and ensuring them in education. This requires changes in how we deal with child work, how we understand what an education is, and the roads to provide children with a valuable education. Much research has shown how it isn't necessarily work that conflicts with children having an education, and how it is a traditional institution of formal schooling what makes work and education seem incompatible. Many children do not go to school, not because their work does not allow them to, but because the schooling system is too rigid for their needs. Schools ought to adapt to the reality of children work. We must provide mechanisms to enable their access to an education without forcing them to relinquish their working needs. Flexible schedules, school feeding programs, vocational training, applied learning. These are all mechanisms that could be used to incentivize workers getting an education. Most children who work, if asked, will tell you that they would, of course, want to have an education. But for the schooling system not to fail them, it has to accommodate to them. Much of this implies revising how we understand the mechanisms through which an education is provided. For many children, the work environment is an invaluable source of education. Children in rural areas who work in farms, for example, reap the greatest educative benefits from actually practicing their trade, understanding the cropping cycles, etc. Of course, for children's work experience to be of pedagogical value requires them working on something that actually helps them grow. The problem with banning children from working is that it has the consequence of sending the children to work in non-formative exploitative labor. Thus, protecting their rights as workers can have a highly positive impact on the kind of work they do, the wage they receive, the hours they work, which means they can better control and balance their schooling and their working responsibilities. Of course, this is not necessarily an ideal situation, but if we are concerned with real-world problems, real-world individuals and their actual lives and opportunities, developing normative proposals for ideal circumstances can be irrelevant and potentially irresponsible. Even if working from a conceptual and theoretical perspective, morally problematic issues such as child poverty, child exploitation, and lack of opportunities must be addressed thinking of our actual subjects of research in mind, rather than abstracting from their realities and situated lives. This is it for now. I'm happy to hear all the questions you may have and criticisms. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Nico. I wonder if you could take down the slides and then we could see if people want to put up their hands and have questions. There was already a comment in the chat from Gemma about the history. I don't know if you want to expand on that, Gemma, or if you, do come in.
It's not really a question, but everything that Nico is saying makes a lot of sense in terms of what was happening here in England in the late 19th century, where there was a popular revolt against the introduction of mandatory schooling, and people demonstrated in the streets against being forced to send their children to school for exactly the reasons that you are articulating. It is never recorded in kind of histories of popular education, where we hear a lot about mechanics institutes, but some of these very real dilemmas around the economics of family life get hidden. And I think what you're flagging up is that the economics of family life matter, but they matter very differently to families than they do to economists looking at it from outside.
Thanks, Gemma. Invitation to anybody listening to raise their hand. I'm scrolling through the names just to see if there are any hands raised or any other questions in the chat. While people are thinking, Nico, one of the questions I have in mind is that because you've set up your argument by counterposing school and work, the institutions that you're counterposing are the school, which is very formal, and Patricia, I've seen you, yes, and then the economy, the kind of terrain of work, which is completely unbounded. But in fact, there are a range of other formal institutions, particularly the social welfare institutions, child poverty grants, where and how close water, whether there's early childhood education provided. There's a whole range of other institutions. So I wondered if you, how you think about that sort of issue. And Patricia, were you putting up your hand, or was that just, did you want to intervene? That was just that's the question. No, okay. So Ursula has asked if the 2010 UK Equality Act actually covers child poverty, and if so, how is that formulated? And I'll take one more question.
Elaine.
Okay,
Yeah,
Kaya
yeah.
has a question. Yes, please. Kaya.
And then James Wilson too.
And then James Wilson. So Kaya, James Wilson, and then Nico can respond.
Hi, thank you so much for the informative talk. So you presented the dilemma such that children have to work because of economic reasons. Well, children cannot stop working because stopping working means earning less income, which then will put them into more of even more disadvantaged position. And I also wonder whether there's other points of dilemma such that like some industries also seem to require or demand child labor. I was thinking about child actors, for example, or figure skating industry. That seem to, I know these are kind of like extreme, quirky examples, but I know just biographically, like I know, so for example, Shia LaBeouf comes from a very difficult, adverse background where he was, raised by a single parent who was alcoholic and very abusive, and working as a child actor in the Hollywood for him was the only means to earn income, to provide income for his family. So, or figure skating industry also seems to profit quite a bit off of children's, intense practice and so on. So I'm wondering if, or my impression of the sort of dilemma was more like two ways. One is the one that you presented, and the other is that some parts of the world does require or demand child labor. And I was wondering what you thought of that.
Thanks, Kaya. And James.
Yeah, it was in a similar theme, so that I found your argument pretty convincing, but I was thinking that one way to respond to it was rather than saying, well, we need to find ways of making education more flexible so that children can work and get an education at the same time. Presumably somebody could say, well, no, what this shows is that we need, in certain circumstances, to be paying children to remain in education, and it may not turn out to be that much more expensive than the kind of flexibility that you suggested. I was just wondering whether that be an alternative to your way of thinking.
Okay, thanks, Nico.
Great, thanks, thanks everyone. I think I'll go in order. Thanks for all these questions. So I think responding to Gemma's comment, I think it's interesting that you mentioned the issue of 19th century England. And I have the feeling that you find a similar situation happening in many developed countries right now. And I especially know about the Latin American situation, and you see it very clearly. So not only parents, actually, I think child worker activists themselves today have this same appeal. So I think especially in Bolivia and Peru, they have been very, very adamant to not have their working rights taken away, or to have working rights that they didn't have before. I mean, of course, I have a lot of ethical issues with how to, let's say, how to stand in relation to these normative, let's say, normative positions. Because on the one hand, you know that, let's say, from a best interest perspective of the child, it's definitely not best for them to be working on the street than to just simply having, let's say, a standard typical Western childhood. But based on the inevitable reality that they live and being constrained by the non-ideal circumstances, it seems that we need to, let's say, we need to navigate this reality and try to find the best possible ways to avoid the harms and exploitations tied to these circumstances while trying to reap the most benefits out of them. Right? Yeah, I think that, I mean, this would be my position as opposed to probably many of the detractors in the 19th century against child labor laws, probably because they had certain economic interests in this happening. But I think I'm trying to see it from a different perspective, whether I can defend the working rights of children without falling into this trap of being the evil, exploitative landlord. I don't know how successful I will be with this, but this is it, at least. With regards to Elaine's, your point on social welfare, yes, definitely. I think I agree. So I think that part of the problem, I have the feeling that part of the problem twirls is, I think it's more, it affects more the legal and the legal debate on the issue of how to deal with education and labor, rather than I'm thinking more more complex policy-making discussions. I mean, I think I agree completely with you, and I actually, one of the points that I try to make is we need to include this social welfare element into the equation. Simply assuming that education and work are a tandem is what I think is erroneous, at least in the legal theory of it, and that we need to be a bit more aware of not only the actual policy making, because as you mentioned, I mean, there are already many social welfare programs in place. There are a lot of conditional cash transfer schemes. I'm thinking of the Bolsa Familia in Brazil, for example, which I think it has been relatively successful in precisely achieving this, is compensating children's income by, let's say, compelling parents to send them to school and to ensuring that they have a health. And I do agree, and I think this is a fundamental element. Of course, the fact that I mean, different countries may have different resources available to address, to tackle, let's say, this social welfare and this poverty issue directly, may mean that we need to find alternative, creative forms of education in order to at least partially and temporarily, let's say, put a patch in the education issue for working children. On Ursula's comment on the UK Equality Act, I'm not sure. Okay, she expanded on the question because I wasn't very sure what the point was. The reason of my question is that the category of discrimination tend to include age, under 18s in work, disability, blah, 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 sexual orientation. But there doesn't appear to be much about the discrimination of children in poverty. I'm not sure, Ursula, if I get your question correctly, if you could briefly expand on what you mean by discrimination of children in poverty.
So James, what I think is that the categories in the UK Equalities Act are they're non-economic categories. So they're categories in relation to race and ethnicity and gender and age. I think Ursula, yeah, she's saying not mentioned in the Act. Okay.
I think I would have to think of this a bit further because I'm not well versed on the UK Equality Act.
Yeah, but I think what it sets up is this dichotomy in relation to inequalities that you were alerting us to. Also, the lack of a discourse of intersectionality. That's yeah. Let's just.
I think that's a good point, and I'm not sure about the Equality Act in itself, but I think that many non-discrimination policies in general have this issue, not only of not addressing the economic issues that may affect an individual being discriminated, but also I think age is a strong determinant for discrimination in many ways, and I think that working rights, in a sense, can be considered discriminatory in many ways. The fact that very strict minimum age are defined for a very diverse world and for very diverse economic and cultural circumstances may be problematic for individuals who have their rights to work restricted just because of their age. But Ursula, thanks for the comment. I am going to have to look into the UK Equality Act further to be able to think about it. Yes, Kaye, thank you for raising the point of actors, and you mentioned skaters, but I think it would apply to any sporting activity. I think that it's curious that you mentioned this because these are actually, the entertainment industry is the only industry that is protected from child labor laws. It's the only realm that the ILO, the International Labor Organization, hasn't dared to put their foot on. Precisely, I think, because there is a certain dependence on child work for these industries to subsist, and despite the fact that many children are in fact exploited as actors, I mean, in the entertainment industry, in TV or in sports, I think that the issue of, I mean, the case of the in many countries, the fact that children are reared into being elite athletes. I mean, the case of exploitation is very clear. I think that this is a very problematic problem, because it really shows that the economic interest in child labor is what guides the law, and not necessarily our moral intuitions of what is exploitative labor and what is not. And oh, James, thanks for mentioning the fact. So I think that this is a good point. I'm not sure if the indirect. Well, I think that right now there are already indirect forms in which children are paid to go to school. So I mentioned the Bolsa Familia is an example of this. Well, they're not paid directly to children, but families are paid for sending their child to school and for proving that their children are going to school. In a sense, I think that these kind of proposals already exist in place. I think personally, I don't know if you agree with the proposal that you mentioned, but I think I would be more closer to one as yours rather than sending it to the family. I believe that if we interpret that the child's time is valuable economic activity, maybe it should be compensated to them and directly. I think that this is actually a good solution. Instead of flexibilizing school, ensuring that they have an income that compensates for their time, I think that it would be a justified option for some cases. I mean, I think that this would have to be explored case by case and working situations.
Thanks very much, Nico, and thanks everyone.
Thanks so much, Elaine.
We've got a great range of issues now in front of us about navigating in non-ideal circumstances, thinking about what kinds of benefits for whom, and intersectionality, ways in which the law doesn't articulate well with the experiences on the ground, and a concern to be creative in thinking about education and the kinds of discussions we have. Thanks very much for setting up such a rich framing for us in so many different directions, Nico.